This panel is going to be individual presentations, and we'll have our 4 speakers from the agency leadership around the state. We're going to start with Jen Shea with APCD and CDPHE. She's going to talk to you when each one's going to speak, and then they're going to come back up for a group question and answer with the state agency folks. So with that, I welcome Jen Shea with APCD. Thank you.
So, morning, my name is Jen Shea. I'm the Deputy Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Colorado Air Pollution Control Division. I'm here on behalf of the APCD to give you an update on everything we've been up to for the last 12 plus months. I promise to try and speak in a calming voice. I understand some of you might have a little bit of a hangover from last night, so hopefully you enjoyed the festivities. So I'll do my best. The agenda for this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about last year's legislation and how that impacts the Air Pollution Control Division and some of the oil and gas industry members. I'll give you an update on regulatory changes, and then I'll go over a couple quick policy and procedure updates. Sorry. There we go. So there were 2 bills that were signed last year that impacted the oil and gas industry in our division. House Bill 23-1294, pollution protection measures. There was a couple things in there that impacted us. So it created basically a process for the community to address complaints. And so for the division, it set a timeline for responses, added kind of a baseline for our enforcement group to assess penalties if needed. And then it also put some requirements in the rule for AQCC hearings. And I think you heard this yesterday. It also created an interim committee for ozone. And so that committee convened last fall and finished up right before legislative session this year. It's probably why, I think they probably had a lot of great ideas, and it's why we see the legislative session so active this year. Senate Bill 2316 was on greenhouse gas reduction measures, and that established some new interim greenhouse gas targets, different from the targets that had previously been released. And so those were greenhouse gas reduction goals, greenhouse reduction goals, from the 2005 baseline. So that set a 65% reduction by 2035, a 75% reduction by 2040, and a 90% reduction by 2045. And it also increased the 2050 goal from 90% to 100%, so a net zero target. Now on to some of the regulatory updates. A lot of things happened here. You can see by the list of rules that have changed. So Reg 22, it requires industrial sector sources statewide to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. Anna talked a little bit about this, so this will impact, for the oil and gas industry, will impact the midstream sector. Reg 26 established some new NOx emission standards for both diesel and natural gas fired engines. Reg 28 established some energy efficiency requirements, we're calling them the building performance standards, for large buildings statewide. Reg 29 put into place some in-use restrictions for small handheld lawn and garden equipment, but this is just for the federal, state, and local governments. So the local governments here, just so you know, those kick in during ozone season. They're just during ozone season, so be aware of that. And then we took what was the large Reg 7 rule and split it out into some more manageable regulations. And so we have now Reg 7, which is still the oil and gas rules. Reg 22 is now the greenhouse gas reduction regulations. Reg 25 contains requirements for surface coating solvents, asphalt graphic arcs, probably ones that you won't look at very often. And then Reg 26 is requirements for engines and other large major stationary sources. And so I'll focus on Reg 3 and Reg 7 in the next couple slides and some of the details, since those impact you. So for Reg 3, we adopted some enhanced modeling and monitoring requirements for certain sources. And these are just for sources in disproportionately impacted communities. I'm going to say DI communities, because if you say that a lot, your words get jumbled from this point forward. And those enhanced monitoring will begin July of this year. So the state is working on finalizing, can y'all hear me? Did it shut off? Oh, did I mute it? There we go. Is that better? Yeah, okay. So we're finalizing a monitoring protocol right now that should be out in the next couple weeks. And those requirements will either be source-specific monitoring or they can be community-based monitoring as well. Another piece of that change in Reg 3 is going to require new sources to meet reasonably available control technology, so RACT, and that's located in the cumulatively impacted communities, the CI communities. Lots of changes in Reg 7, and so at the end of last year we had to make some updates to our SIP, our severe ozone SIP, so we did that in the December rulemaking. We're also working on the governor's directive to find additional reductions of NOx in the non-attainment area and during ozone season. So in December of 2023, we finalized some in-use requirements for the pre-production segment. And so those are drilling and completions operations. Again, this is only the non-attainment area and only during ozone season, and so that kicks in next month. And it is basically going to establish a standard of, NOx emitted per BOE. I'm sorry. There's specific requirements for, in pre-production, there's different requirements whether you're inside a CI community or outside a CI community. And then as part of that, they also set a NOx intensity standard to help achieve those same reductions. Again, only in the non-attainment area and only during ozone season, so start soon. And it establishes a NOx emitted per BOE. And those standards, depending on the size of your operations, can become more stringent every year through 2026. And then we also just kicked off a NOx reduction steering committee. I think I heard the last panel talk about this. We're trying to achieve that additional 20% reduction by 2030 to get to 50%. So we just kicked that off in March. There's not really an end date on that, so that will continue through much of this year, and depending on what we come up with for those additional reductions, will depend on kind of when we make those proposals to the Air Quality Control Commission. I'm just going to give a really brief update on EnviroScreen because I know the next panel will probably hit some more detailed points on that. And I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm going to read it. So Colorado EnviroScreen is an interactive environmental justice mapping tool. It uses 35 different data-driven indicators to characterize a population of a community and then the potential environmental burdens that could be on those communities depending on the operations. It was originally defined in the 2021 EJ Act, Legislative EJ Act, and then amended last year in the legislative process. So we're working from EnviroScreen 1.0 now. And I know we've gotten a lot of comments with suggested recommendations on changes to EnviroScreen. So we're working on EnviroScreen 2.0 that should be released by the end of the year. Greenhouse gas, it's been definitely a topic of conversation the last couple days. And so we've got some very specific statewide targets and then some specific oil and gas targets. So we're trying to achieve those reduction targets, also pursue a lot of the EJ objectives, and then get that co-benefit pollutant from reducing greenhouse gases. And so just so a reminder to everyone, because there's a lot of numbers being thrown out, but for oil and gas, we have a 36% reduction requirement by 2025 and a 60% reduction target by 2030, which is a little different than the statewide targets. So the statewide targets are 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and then that changed to net zero by 2050, along with some of those interim targets I just mentioned. So a lot of numbers to remember. But since 2021, we've been passing a lot of regulations to help reduce the greenhouse gas footprint in the state. And on the oil and gas industry specifically, most of those are contained in Reg 7. And so we've got some increased LDAR frequency inspections. You'll all be potentially installing flow meters on your enclosed combustion devices, and then there's emission testing requirements for those enclosed combustion devices. I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. and then new emission standards for things like well unloading, pigging, and blowdowns. And then some additional pneumatic controller requirements. Sounds like Karis is taking advantage of that and installing nitrogen actuated controllers. And then those requirements will differ depending on whether you're inside a disproportionately impacted community or outside of a disproportionately impacted community, and also whether you're in or out of the non-attainment area. And then we wrap all that up with a big bow, and the oil and gas industry is doing annual emissions reporting to the state now. So that'll help us figure out the changes that are happening year over year and making sure we're complying with all of our targets. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about intensity and some of the midstream regulations in this slide. So this gives you some specifics on some of the timelines. There's a lot going on between last year and this year on these two programs in particular. So just give you a little refresher. The greenhouse gas intensity program, different than the NOx intensity program, a draft was published in November of 2022, and we have a final rule that happened July of last year. And when I say intensity, I mean carbon dioxide, CO2e per 1,000 BOE, barrel of oil equivalent, you probably all know that. And this includes production and pre-production operations statewide. So those specific intensity targets are going to change depending on your compliance year and the volume of production that the operators have. And just as a reminder, this program regulates a greenhouse gas intensity and not a methane intensity. So it's going to include things like combustion. We also have a verification process for those calculations that's in the rule as well. And I know my team has been working really hard on that intensity protocol, so the greenhouse gas intensity protocol. Ben touched on it a little bit in his presentation yesterday. And we expect that, I think comments were due on Monday, so we expect that to be final very soon and released. And just as a reminder too, it's a living document, so as folks use that protocol and find better ways to do things or changes needed to the protocol, we can update those. I think it's an annual requirement, if I remember correctly. And Anna did a really good job talking about the midstream sector yesterday, and so you got a lot of great information. So I just want to give a couple reminders on some key dates. So the segment-wide emission reduction plan, the SERP, was finalized and sent to the division at the end of March. And so we're working on getting that posted in the next couple weeks. That'll be available for public comment for 30 days. And that SERP will help inform a division rule. And so that division rule, we're starting work on that now, doing stakeholder engagement. That will be proposed to the commission in August. And then a projected, I call that the Happy Holidays December rulemaking for the oil and gas industry. And I think I was asking some folks at the division the other day, when was the last time we didn't have an oil and gas rulemaking in December? And I think the answer was 2015. So it's been a long time that we've spent a lot of time together over the holidays, or right before the holidays. This isn't super new, but it's about 1.5 years old. And so there's been some changes to the general permitting process. So if you haven't submitted a general permit application previously, historically, you could submit a general permit application and start construction and operation really quickly. And so there's been some changes to that where a modeling determination is required. And so that modeling determination, you're using a Form 114, submitting it to the division, getting a modeling determination back that has to be included in your general permit application. And so that now, I think the big key takeaway from this slide is that it just takes longer. You used to be able to get the permit and start construction. You're just going to have to add in a little bit of lead time if you haven't submitted one in a while. I promised to get to this. So enclosed combustion devices. I know there's just, I guess, to give everyone a little bit of a refresher, we updated Reg 7 in 2022 that was required operators to test enclosed combustion devices and this, the requirement is a percentage of your total enclosed combustion devices, and it depends, timing depends on whether you're inside of a DI community or inside the non-attainment or outside. And I know there's been some challenges with some of these testing protocols and not being able to complete some of your emission tests. And so we published a standard protocol in October of 2022. And then there were some issues. We've been working really closely with EPA because EPA Quad O, B, and C will have the exact same issues. And so we released what we thought would be a better protocol that could help some of the operators out, but I'm not sure it helped. So we're working on another new protocol in development. It's an alternative that hopefully will answer some of the questions that y'all have had or the challenges you've had with that. And finally, last slide, EJ summaries. These are now required in every permit application that the division receives. The team has done a really good job getting those processed and through. We've even created a more streamlined online process to help speed that along. So, a lot going on. That's all I had.
All right. Good morning. My name is Aaron Ray. I'm Assistant Director for Energy Innovation in the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. First, I want to express that Executive Director Dan Gibbs was regretful he couldn't be here with you today. There are multiple conferences going on around the state, but he appreciates this opportunity to talk about DNR's energy programs and other priorities. It wouldn't be a state agency presentation without showing you an org chart. The Department of Natural Resources has 6 major divisions. You're going to hear from Julie Murphy, Director of the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. You're going to hear from Brian Magee from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We also have a Division of Reclamation, Mining, Safety. We have the Colorado Water Conservation Board, Division of Water Resources, and the State Land Board as well. I want to stick on this slide for a moment because there's another element of DNR that's important to the oil and gas industry that is actually within the Executive Director's Office, not within one of our divisions, and that's the Colorado Produced Water Consortium. That body was created last year in House Bill 23-1242, and that bill has requirements for ECMC to collect data around produced water from oil and gas operations, undertake a rulemaking. I'm going to let Director Murphy talk about those things if you have questions about those. But that bill also created the Produced Water Consortium, which is a 31-member body, sits within the Executive Director's Office, not in ECMC. It's chaired by Commissioner John Messner from the ECMC Commission. And that body is charged with studying issues around produced water and ultimately making recommendations to ECMC to inform their rulemaking at the end of this year. That consortium has been meeting monthly since the fall. They have a number of deliverables that are required. The first one was delivered to the General Assembly on March 1st. That was a report focused on best practices in produced water management. And there'll be a number of additional reports coming from that group. But their meetings are open to the public. That body includes representation from industry, from academia, from nonprofit groups and others. And so we think it's really a great opportunity to be a leader in the country around produced water. We're collaborating with consortium in other states. So wanted you to be aware that sits within DNR and the Executive Director's Office. You heard yesterday from Garen about a number of the legislative initiatives related to oil and gas that are in the legislature right now. So I'm not going to focus much on those, but want to talk a bit about some of DNR's legislative and budget priorities this session. The first that you've heard about is House Bill 24-1346. That's the Energy and Carbon Management Regulation Bill. That was something that was initiated by the department. You're aware that as ECMC had an expanded mission last year, changed the name from OGCC to ECMC, the commission was given the authority to regulate carbon sequestration operations. In the process of working through that authority, we realized that there were some additional authorities that we were not granted last session that would be necessary for ECMC to carry out the direction they've been given by the legislature. And so this bill does sort of 3 main things related to carbon sequestration. One, it clarifies ECMC's authority over ancillary facilities. So these are sort of pieces of the operation that we didn't feel like the authority to regulate were clear in the last session. It establishes in state law the ownership of pore space, which is necessary to give operators certainty around these projects. And it creates a process to unitize that pore space to allow for projects that cover multiple individual pore space owners. That bill is passed the House. It's on to the Senate, so we're optimistic that we will receive that additional authority this session. A couple of other bills that are not directly oil and gas related, but are department priorities. Senate Bill 24-171 would authorize CPW to reintroduce wolverines in the state. That bill passed the Senate yesterday, on to the House now. So again, hopeful that that will make it through the legislature. It's important to note that under that authority, CPW would need to first get what's called a 10J ruling from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before wolverines would be introduced. It also creates a compensation program for any losses associated with wolverine reintroduction. House Bill 24-1117 gives CPW the authority to study and ultimately conserve invertebrates and rare plants. So we think that is an important addition to the work that CPW is currently doing. That bill is currently in Senate appropriation. And then two annual, what we call projects bills. The annual Species Conservation Trust Fund project bill is in Senate appropriations. That provides funding for a variety of species conservation projects. And the annual Colorado Water Conservation Board projects bill is in House appropriations, and that makes funding available for a variety of water projects. So those are two important annual bills that we're excited to have passed this year. And then the last two things I want to note is the annual budget bill, the long bill, has passed the General Assembly. It's on to the governor, where we expect it to be signed. DNR is proud that we have a number of budget priorities that are reflected in that bill, including a request for CPW to add capacity around biodiversity and for the State Land Board to create a new biodiversity program. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to start implementing those as soon as the new fiscal year starts. You heard yesterday from Quinn Antis, from CEO, about the greenhouse gas roadmap. She talked about the carbon management elements of that roadmap. I want to focus here about some of the oil and gas related pieces of that roadmap. The context here, as you've heard a bunch, is that as state agencies, we're governed by the direction from the legislature. The legislature has told us we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so the roadmap is intended to identify actions that we can take to help us meet those statutorily defined targets. The first roadmap was released in 2021. We've implemented or have begun implementing much of the direction in that roadmap. But as we're approaching the 2026 and 2030 greenhouse gas reduction targets, we know that there's more work that we need to do to meet those targets set by the legislature. And so we spent the last year doing stakeholder work to develop an updated roadmap, Roadmap 2.0. That was released in February. It has 49 new, what we call near-term actions. These are things that we can implement in the next few years that'll help us meet our 2030 reduction target. That has direction to every sector, transportation, buildings, electricity generation, but also oil and gas. And as was mentioned just a moment ago, it is important to note that the oil and gas sector has really made significant progress in reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is to the credit of all of you. But just as every other sector needs to continue to reduce emissions, we know there's opportunities to do that in oil and gas. I will note that there was other energy-related direction in the roadmap that I'm not going to talk about, but you should be aware of. We've heard yesterday about the carbon management pieces of that. There's also direction that includes direction to DNR around hydrogen energy development and around coal mine methane reduction. So those are also areas in which we're going to be working. But I want to just briefly talk about some of the oil and gas-related items. You just heard from Jen about the CDPHE's GHG intensity requirements, so I'm not going to talk much about that, but one of the near-term actions in the roadmap is to continue implementation of that rule. The next one I think you will be interested in, and this is direction to both DNR, to ECMC, and to CDPHE to develop a framework for what we're calling net GHG neutral oil and gas developments. The idea here is that these would be voluntary for operators, but we would create a framework whereby operators could identify across a portfolio of projects, so not necessarily for any specific project, but sort of company-wide, a strategy to get to net GHG neutral oil and gas development. So that would be reducing emissions as much as you can, which you're already doing, and for the remainder of the emissions from production, could you identify offsets, carbon capture, plug existing wells to end up with a net GHG neutral production. One of the bits of feedback we got from industry in the process of working on this over the last year was to expand it to a whole portfolio of projects rather than a single project to enable operators to spread those emissions across that portfolio. That was reflected in the final roadmap. So this is something that is going to take some time to work on. You'll see there's a time frame here that says 2025. That's when we're going to start, not when we're going to finish. There's a lot of work to do, and we look forward to working with you to help achieve that. A couple other things that were included in the roadmap was direction to find ways to provide credit for operators for emissions reductions associated with plugging wells. And so that's something that ECMC will be pursuing. There was also direction to first track and then find ways to reduce emissions from truck traffic associated with oil and gas production. And we think there's opportunities for that. And last, for wells that have reached the end of their life and you're, as an operator, under the obligation to plug and abandon, we know that there are innovative technologies that might allow that infrastructure to be used for some other productive use. And so we've received direction from the roadmap to study some of those other potential uses of a well at the end of its life. So maybe that's carbon sequestration, maybe that's geothermal. We've got companies interested in what's called gravity energy storage. There's lots of potential uses. We want to figure out how can we make it possible and economic for operators to find other uses of that infrastructure beyond just plugging and abandoning wells, so that we've already disturbed the surface, we already have some infrastructure in place, maybe we've got line power to that site. Let's make use of that infrastructure and not simply plug and abandon the well. So that's something we'll be working on as well. Be happy to answer any questions. I know we're going to do that at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Director Murphy. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to our hosts for facilitating this event. Thank you, Kirby. It's great to see some familiar faces and even some new faces, including another alumni from Kansas State University. Go Wildcats. You know, I'm an irresponsible human who doesn't always prepare slides, so bear with me, forgive me for that. I think if we think about 2023 and recap at the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, it was a watershed year. We transitioned from only regulating oil and gas to also regulating deep geothermal, Class 6 or carbon sequestration wells, and gas storage. I think, as is key for a local government conference, it's important to note that the local government voice in all of those new regulatory arenas is more profound and more focused, recognizing the important co-relationship that the state and locals have in looking at energy-related projects. That transition was enormous and continues to be. It's involved a fair amount of stakeholder work, and I'll get into kind of the outcomes of that stakeholder work in a few minutes. We also worked very closely and are continuing to work even more closely with the Air Pollution Control Division on achieving the governor's directives on NOx reductions, working with the greenhouse gas intensity and understanding how our systems can work together, our two regulatory systems can work more efficiently together. That also appears to be a topic in the legislature, which I'm sure you heard about yesterday as well. We also did a lot of stakeholder work on cumulative impacts, what it means, where it's going, what should be included in it. It is a term that is broad enough to encompass lots of things, or it could be read to be very, very focused on what are cumulative impacts from oil and gas and how are we doing it. I think that the main thrust of that opportunity is how can we continue to do this better, which I think Colorado is incredible at when it comes to oil and gas development, frankly. Looking forward now to 2024, we have a robust regulatory agenda coming. We are in the midst of a high priority habitat rulemaking that is focused on, coincidentally, the northwest quadrant of the state. Thanks to our partners at CPW, folks in the local government space, folks in the ENGO space, and the oil and gas industry for engaging in that. We are looking forward to the outcomes of that. That hearing is scheduled for May 22nd, so stay tuned. We also had initiated a cumulative impacts rulemaking that has in a slight pause while we monitor the legislative session and what may come out of it to help better focus our efforts and our stakeholders' time. But I do expect that that will be completed sometime in 2024. We've been going now back to where I started, which is we've transitioned our mission to broaden out what it is we're regulating. We're working very closely with stakeholders and industry on preparing deep geothermal rules to regulate deep geothermal wells to generate utility scale electricity, or provide other options, whether it's district heating. But again, we're focused on those wells that are deeper than 2,000 feet, and it appears to be a great opportunity for Colorado to explore yet another manner in which to utilize the subsurface. So we expect to get those draft rules out in the near term. We've been planning for a summer rulemaking on that. But again, we're continuing to watch what's going on and making sure we're respectful of folks' time and resources when it comes to our different rulemaking processes. In addition to geothermal, we're also working very hard on Class 6 or carbon sequestration well rules. Once we promulgate these rules, we would then have the ability to go to EPA and request primacy for that program, which would let Colorado be in the driver's seat when it comes to permitting carbon sequestration wells in the state. I think that that's the best thing for Colorado as a native and somebody who's passionate about how we do things here. We also are working on a worker certification rulemaking. This is one of the last remaining rulemakings coming out of 19181 to make sure that we're, in the right space in terms of recognizing the importance of worker safety and certifications without treading into the OSHA space. And then the last rulemaking that we anticipate this calendar year 2024, is around produced water, and I'm glad Aaron touched on the Produced Water Consortium. The work of that group is fundamental to understanding what opportunities there are in Colorado to continue to improve it. I appreciate that it's a diverse group working on an incredibly complicated topic. I will say that our operators in the Northwest are really leading the pack when it comes to produced water management. Y'all have been on this for a long time and are doing it really well. And I think it's incumbent on the rest of the state to try to learn from that work and see how we can do it better elsewhere. So again, we are looking forward to our rulemaking on produced water at the end of the calendar year as directed by legislation from 2023. I've said it a couple times, we're continuing to monitor the legislative discussion. In addition to the regulatory work, with the growth in what it is that we're doing and what it is we're regulating and a number of these emerging technologies, even though many of them are grounded in lots of experience from across the world, they're somewhat emerging in Colorado. We have been tasked with doing a couple of studies. We released a study on CCS safety in early February. I think it's an outstanding study if you want to get kind of an orientation and a primer for what carbon sequestration looks like. It touches on all facets of it, and I know there's a ton of information out there on this topic, but I really can't tout it enough as a great place to start or to help answer questions. And if you have questions about that, you should ask Mike Rigby, who's in the room, because he was and continues to be critical in getting that done. We have a geothermal study coming out later this year in a couple of months, and then we're working on hydrogen and pipeline studies as well. So again, trying to make sure that we collectively all understand what it is we're talking about, what it is we're regulating, and how it fits into our state. As is very important in this part of the state, we are working closely with BLM on a number of different fronts. I know that they've recently released their final rule on leasing and bonding reform. That intersects with our recent financial assurance rules. And now that those rules are final, we will be working closely with stakeholders and industry on how to integrate the federal requirements and have them considered as part of the state requirements so we get a complete look at an operator's financial assurance portfolio. So stay tuned on that. I recognize that the conversation around financial assurance is particularly complicated when you look at the different regimes between the state and the federal government, what that financial assurance is provided for, how it's provided. And so there's kind of multiple pieces of it, and I think that there's also a pretty long phase-in, so we need to be thinking about all those components as we build a program that recognizes both aspects, both regulatory aspects. I would take maybe 10 seconds to just acknowledge that with much of this change has come growth in our organization. When I started with this organization, we were about 65 people. We're now 172, and I think we have 22 vacancies. So we have been experiencing tremendous growth and been through a tremendous amount of recruiting. We've been incredibly lucky with the talent that we've been able to recruit. I'm grateful for that. I think we're building out a great team that can provide the customer service that Colorado expects of us. And we have an intense focus on hiring and making sure that our organization is functioning, intact, responsive, and creating a culture that we would expect. So with that, I would close out my remarks and look forward to your questions and turn it over to Mr. Magee from CPW. Oops, sorry.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Magee. I'm the Energy Liaison for Colorado Parks and Wildlife based in the Southwest region. So I'm out of Durango. That's where I live. I'm really, as Aaron said, there's a lot of other conferences going on around the state, and Director Davis from CPW wished he could be here to give this speech, but he sends his apologies and sent me here instead. So I apologize to you that you have me. So. Real quick, I think we're just going to give, there we go, just agency updates, just broad view of what CPW's been working on in the last year, sort of from that director's perspective. And then if there are questions when we get into the Q&A about sort of the energy liaisons and my counterpart Taylor, who's here in the Northwest, how we interface with ECMC staff, we can get into that stuff too. But 2023 was a pretty big year for CPW on a number of fronts. One of the big ones is the Keep Colorado Wild Pass, which if you've renewed your registration, it's an opportunity to get a state parks pass for $29 when you renew your vehicle registration. In calendar year 23, we sold approximately 1.5 million passes. And generated $41 million in the sales of that. And those sales are to basically fund parks maintenance and development. And so that's a state parks program. And the first there's $36 million allocated in it. That's the goal, is to get $36 million a year. $2.5 million of those are going to go to backcountry search and rescue, and then about $1 million of that goes to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. And then any additional revenue beyond that $36 million gets sort of divided amongst wildlife programs and outdoor education programs. But that's been a success, and we don't have the numbers yet for 24, but we should have that in a couple months. Another little mess up on the side there. If you didn't know, we have been planning around wolf reintroduction for a number of years based on ballot initiative 114 that was then codified into CRS 33-1058, which basically directed us to restore wolves. We did that. CPW released 10 wolves at the end of December, mid-December in Colorado. There has been a lot of conversation around wolves. I have been the one who's not been part of that conversation, so I'm probably the least knowledgeable on wolves of anybody. But if there's questions that, we can try to handle those. We're really looking at 24, 25 this year, and in trapping season, we have an agreement with the Colville tribes in Washington to capture up to 15 more wolves to bring into the state at the end of the year. And we're really there's a lot of conversation around, compensation and game damage prevention with wolves, and so that's an ongoing conversation and a lot of learning that's still going on. But we have resources. CPW has resources to help producers out there, and if there's problems, you need to just contact your local CPW staff. Another big initiative that we're working on is a statewide habitat connectivity plan. This is really coming out of our strategic plan. And those elements that are up there in the bullet points on the board. Also the 2020 Big Game Status Report, and then the DNR's Opportunity Report. And that's all kind of built upon Governor Polis's Executive Order 2019-011, which was directing the agencies to work towards the conservation of migratory corridors and critical winter ranges for big game. So that's a planning process to prioritize landscape conservation and connectivity for select species. Internally, we're going through that process now of identifying those priority landscapes and the species that we want to work on, but that will transition after June into a stakeholder-based process where we're going to engage with our partners in the land trust community and the agricultural community, BLM Forest Service for doing habitat work, and really try to have a focused effort on where we're spending our resources on habitat work and conservation. The thing that people have been talking about this is CPW is really good at doing random acts of conservation. through our habitat work, and this is really designed to say, what are our priorities, how are we going to get those done, and which partnerships can we leverage to do that? Another big initiative is every 10 years we update our Species Wildlife Action Plan, which is called the SWAP. That SWAP really looks at the species we have in Colorado and identifies those species of greatest conservation need, the threats that those species face, and actions to reduce those threats. And the main goal of this exercise is preventing listing under the ESA for either threatened or endangered species. And so this plan sort of becomes a bit of a roadmap for CPW and how we prioritize species inventory, species conservation work. I will say, in terms of thinking about, what are the biggest threats to biodiversity in Colorado, the long-term threats are likely climate change, but the short-term threats are definitely development. And not just development from oil and gas, but development of all kinds, residential, recreational development. And so sort of thinking about how we are conserving species through that lens of development in the near term is critical for making sure that species don't end up on the endangered species list. And finally, Director Murphy mentioned this, but we have a rulemaking with ECMC for high priority habitats in May. Looking forward to that. There's a lot of new information with GPS collar data and migration corridors that we've incorporated into these maps. Taylor Elm in the Northwest, I know he's been doing a lot of stakeholder outreach to discuss with operators about these changes. We also had our migration connectivity corridor. Michelle Corden gave a presentation to the commission a couple weeks ago, sort of explaining the science behind that data, and so we look forward to that. And we've also been busy working, like Director Vilsack said, on a lot of the BLM stuff. There's the Gunnison Grouse RMP, the Gunnison Sage Grouse RMPA, the Big Game RMPA. We've been spending a significant amount of time, as most of you have, working on those documents with the BLM. So with that, I think we're to Q&A.
Hello, there we go. Hey, my name's Ed Schneider. I'm with Own Resources out in Eastern Colorado. And I think kind of one of the themes through regulation has been an increased priority on taking care when operating in disproportionately impacted communities. And I think about when it started, it came from a really good point. When we think about disproportionately impacted communities, we think about lower income, historically marginalized, and generally think about it as people who have suffered the burden disproportionately for pollution and emissions, et cetera. And it feels like the definition of DI is changing. So in Eastern Colorado, if you look, the communities have been designated DI, it's low income, it's exposure to natural disasters, it's high electricity price. So when we layer on additional costs of and regulatory burden on communities that are suffering more from economic development options as opposed to emissions and pollutions, I think we sometimes actually hurt the people we're trying to help. And I guess the question I have is there an opportunity to step back, use the tools like EnviroScreen to identify the really communities that are low income, burdened by pollution, and kind of focus our efforts there on the people that I think they were originally designed, the regulations were originally designed to help.
I guess I'll take that. Yeah, so, I'm not sure you're aware, but we're directed by the legislature to consider this, right? And I think, part of our rulemaking process, we do a lot of stakeholder outreach. So we're reaching out we have a EJ outreach team. They're getting those stakeholders involved to find out what's important to them when we're actually constructing rules. So I don't know if that answers your question, if that's helpful, but we're definitely listening to those communities to figure out what it is they're looking for, and then trying to incorporate that into the regulation when it's crafted.
Other questions?
Kirby told me if we don't feel the whole time, we'll just roll everything forward to get to lunch sooner. So this is a great chance, but.
Got one over here.
So years ago when we had like, I don't know, 25 rigs in Garfield County and probably 20 up in Rio Blanco, we had like 45 rigs running out here and there was a lot of development going on. There was an article that came out in the Grand Junction Sentinel talking about big game habitat and how it was flourishing. At the same time, we had record activity out there. I mean, I know Wyoming is saying it affects habitat, but then sometimes I think about if you have an oil and gas field out there, it actually preserves habitat as opposed to urban sprawl. Can you kind of address that?
Well, I mean, certainly the science behind the impacts of oil and gas and big game, there's a lot out there. And the regulations that we have with ECMC are designed to avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts. And that's really what we're focusing on. To your point, there are different types of developments that are complete habitat loss, and different industries that are complete habitat loss for all kinds of different wildlife species, big game just in particular. So in your example, sure, subdivision is probably going to be complete habitat loss for big game, whereas in an oil and gas field, you might be able to manage that field in a way that preserves some habitat quality for those species. And so that's the goal, is to have oil and gas development and wildlife, and how are we effectively balancing that through that mitigation hierarchy of avoid, minimize, and mitigate. We don't have that hierarchy in regulation with many other industries. And so you guys are the lucky ones, and you're the ones we like to work with. So.
I got a question over here in the front. I know everybody, the Wolves and the Wolverines, been in the talk for a while. I just wanted to see if the CPW could talk to some benefits on why exactly Wolverines, why exactly Wolves, you know?
Well, so let's take the Wolverines first. So when we did a planning process in the late 90s we looked at the reintroduction of Wolverine and lynx at the same time. And the agency's goal was to try to put those both on the landscape in the early 2000s. And it became logistically challenging and cost prohibitive to do two species at one time. And so we chose lynx. And so we introduced lynx starting in the late 90s, early 2000s. That program, that reintroduction was deemed a success. And so the next logical stepping point was to move on to Wolverines. And so as Aaron pointed out, there's that bill to look at, we need legislative approval to reintroduce Wolverines. That's been introduced. And then the big key piece of that is that 10J rule under the ESA. So that's our mission, is to perpetuate the wildlife species of the state. Wolverines were here in the state, and that's furthering our mission of trying to bring Wolverines back. It's the same with wolves. Even though wolves were, a ballot initiative, they were native to Colorado. They were species that were historically on this landscape, and the conservation of species is our mission. And so that's where we're at today.
And I would just add, one of the priorities for the department, and this is coming from our executive director, is to address what is really a crisis in biodiversity loss. And what I think you saw in my presentation in terms of our legislative and budget priorities is a real focus on using what DNR has available in our jurisdiction to try to address that biodiversity loss. And so you're seeing biodiversity program of the State Land Board, additional capacity at CPW. It's reflected in the legislative priorities, looking at the things people don't pay attention to, the invertebrates and the rare plants, but also these sort of charismatic larger species. So we're looking across the whole portfolio and trying to figure out how can we continue to preserve that biodiversity in Colorado and restore it where we've lost it.
This is probably a silly question, But the last grizzly bear was killed in Colorado in 1979 in the San Juan Mountains, I believe. How about the grizzly bear, if you're talking about this spectrum of species?
So I'll infer your question is, are grizzly bears next? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
What I would say is our colleagues at CPW have their plate full. Right? They're working on wolves. We're hoping to be able to work on wolverines. We have a whole bunch of other things that we're focused on. So we're focused on what we've been directed to do by the legislature, and that's where our focus is.
Gotcha.
I'm almost done. Speak to green energy, would you, on solar and wind, and what are you doing in that?
So I'll start, but we'll welcome others to jump in. There's a number of things that are happening related to how renewables grow in Colorado with respect to wildlife and other resources. So you're probably aware that the governor has a bold goal to get us to 100% renewable energy in the electricity grid by 2040. A lot of what's in that greenhouse gas roadmap plan is focused on how do we facilitate that. But we know that doing that has consequences for land use, has consequences for wildlife. And so modeling by the Energy Office projects that in order to get to that goal, we would need to triple our wind capacity and quintuple our solar capacity in the state. That's a significant land use issue. So how do we do that in a way that balances all of these interests? You heard yesterday from the BLM about a BLM West-wide solar programmatic environmental impact statement. The state has been reviewing that plan and will be submitting comments. And those comments will reflect how we think solar development on federal lands should happen in the state. And we're relying heavily on CPW expertise to do that. I'll also note that there have been lots of conversations happening with a whole range of stakeholders about siting of renewable energy on private lands and state lands, so complementary to the BLM effort. And it's possible that there'll be legislative action around that this session. That has not yet been introduced. But the idea of that is preserving local government siting authority, which is currently the status quo, but also having some minimum standards for the state. I don't know where that's going to go. We've got 20 days left in the legislative session, so we'll see. But the key is we know we need to expand renewable generation, but we want to do it in a way that respects local authority and that balances all these various land uses. And that's, frankly, a hard nut to crack, but that's what we've been working on.
Yeah, I just add that our interest in perpetuating species conservation, we're pretty pragmatic approach in that, right? Like development is going to happen and it's going to have impacts on wildlife, and so our interest as a non-regulatory agency and as an agency that can consult at the request of local governments or works with industry, the renewable industry, we're looking at that same thing as the same structure as oil and gas has in terms of avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And it's really project specific and development specific, but we want to be a resource for developers and local governments if this is a concern in terms of habitat loss. We want to provide you the best information you can have to make good decisions on projects.
I've got a question back here. My name's Vinny. I'm with the town of Parachute, and I was hoping that maybe you could speak a little bit about what plans might be in the works for addressing kind of the CDOT impact to wildlife. It's somewhat energy related, but certainly here in the Northwest Corridor, we have a real issue with that. So it'd be nice to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. As part of that DNR's opportunity report, we have a really good collaboration with CDOT and looking at connectivity on our highway systems and reducing animal vehicle collisions, not only just to save the animals, but also to improve safety for motorists. And so there's a lot of work going on and a lot of collaboration between CDOT and CPW around that, and looking at highway crossing structures, underpasses and overpasses, trying to link public lands with private land conservation to facilitate migration and movement across and underneath highways. There's a massive collaboration of NGOs and agencies, state. This is mostly led by CPW and CDOT, but it's called the Colorado Wildlife Transportation Alliance. There's some, last year there was some funding, a bill passed, the Colorado Safe Passages Act, where the legislature put $5 million into that pot to help with this connectivity issue, working on this transportation piece. And so we've been doing a lot of science and study. We've completed the West Slope prioritization study and the Eastern Plains prioritization study, where we've looked at every 1/10 of a segment highway section in Colorado, and we've looked at their traffic volumes, their animal vehicle collisions, and we have ranked those, and we have a priority list of the top 5% of the worst highway segments for animal vehicle collisions in Colorado. We have maps of those, and so we're really working on trying to connect funding to not only build structures on highways, overpasses and underpasses, combined with high fence, so that we make these animals cross where we want them to cross, motor vehicle safety. So we've got that going on, and then we've got, like I said, this other collaboration of trying to build landscape connectivity to those structures, and trying to connect funding, going after federal funding. A lot of the federal infrastructure grant stuff the state has been putting in for those, trying to suck up as much federal money as we can to improve highway safety and migration and movement for big game.
Any other questions?
I got a question for you guys. I've lived in a couple different states, and I know some states that have done some of the wind and solar and everything else. And once they put them up, they've made permanent changes to migration patterns for birds and animals. Whereas I know a lot of the impact here with rigs and everything else, that migration pattern comes back after the rigs go away. Are you guys considering that when you're talking about land use for wind and solar and everything else, about how migration patterns, especially for birds, may change with those considerations, because those are going to be permanent structures that stay for years and years?
I'll say that in our engagement on federal rules, as well as how the state approaches this, one of the things that we are relying on is CPW's expertise in identifying those high priority habitats, those migration corridors, so that as we're siting this new infrastructure, to your point about the long-term impact of that, we're doing it in the right places, in the places that have the lowest conflict. So a lot of that happens on a project-by-project basis, but it's also informing a statewide approach, and I know it's informing how the BLM thinks about solar on federal lands as well.
All right, and with that, let's have a hand for our agency leaders. Thank you very much for taking time to be with us and educate local governments.